Today's event is part of a cross-country tour organized by CUPE and the Council of Canadians to oppose the proposed trade deal called the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or more commonly referred to as CETA, which is being negotiated by Canada and the EU, the European Union. This tour stop is also co-sponsored by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Public meetings have already been held in Calgary, Montreal, Toronto, and Saskatoon, and I'm hearing they've been well attended, and so that's good to hear. The tour continues this week as folks move on to Halifax and St. John's, and resuming again in the fall. Our meeting tonight takes place just before the critical 8th round of CETA negotiations between Canada and the EU, which will take place in Brussels the week of July 10th. Prime Minister Stephen Harper has said he is committed to proceeding full throttle on CETA and wants to have the deal signed by January 2012. Before I call on our three speakers for their presentations, we have a short video about the trade deal, just to give you a little bit of a perspective.
Higher drug costs. Big European companies controlling our water and sewage systems. Corporations overriding local decision-making. All of these could be a reality thanks to a nasty trade deal being negotiated by Canada and the European Union. Canada and the EU are negotiating a comprehensive economic and trade agreement known as CETA. It's a mouthful to say, and a big deal for Canada. The EU is asking for a lot. The Europeans want access to goods and services that are currently provided in the public sector. These include provincial utilities like Manitoba Hydro, postal services, and access to government purchasing of goods and services at every level. In fact, it's the first time that a trade agreement will include municipal activities like purchasing, infrastructure projects, and the delivery of municipal services. And because it expands the rights of corporations to bid for and provide these services, it will lead to increased privatization of vital community services currently delivered by the public sector. CUPE's national president, Paul Moist, warns that European corporations are looking for access to Canada's public services.
Many of us believe because the deal's not out in the open, it's being driven by, largely, the European Union wanting access to something new for them that they don't have access to now, and that's a large chunk of Canada's public sector.
CETA will also have a big impact on drinking water and water treatment services in our cities and towns. In Canada, most water and water treatment services are taken care of by municipal governments. But big European corporations like Veolia and Suez are looking for new markets. Under CETA, control of our water services would be open for bidding. Here's what Maud Barlow, National Chairperson of the Council of Canadians, says about what CETA means for water in Canada.
CETA is a key threat to public water services. Paul spoke about this. The EU is absolutely insistent that drinking water be included in the disciplines of the deal. And Canada, we should know, has a very aging infrastructure. We have about $31 billion needed in infrastructure investment. Under a CETA, with these big companies, Veolia and Suez and others, in there vying for these contracts, you would have to open all of this up. It would be a 1-2 step to privatization of our water services.
One of the biggest problems with CETA is the impact on democracy. CETA takes power from local governments and gives it to large multinational corporations. The deal would give large European corporations the right to sue Canadian governments when they think a government decision may have a possible negative impact on that company's future profits. Local governments who choose to buy local or exclude for-profit European corporations from bidding on public service contracts could have their right to do so overruled by an unaccountable trade tribunal for violating CETA. Ontario's Green Energy Act, local food procurement, and ethical purchasing policies are all at risk. CETA will even have an impact on health care. If signed, CETA will cause prescription drug costs to skyrocket. A recent study warned that this deal could add $2.8 billion per year to drug costs. That's a lot of money for our already stretched healthcare system to absorb. The EU sells Canada more than $5 billion of pharmaceuticals annually. Now, the EU is demanding more patent protection for drug companies. That means it will take longer to get cheaper generic drugs on the market, driving up costs for all of us. Canadians want their public services to stay in public hands. A recent poll by Environics Research shows Canadians want the public sector to deliver safe, quality services we can count on. We don't have a lot of time. Provincial and federal governments are negotiating and deciding what's on the table and what's left off. The time to act is now. So what can we do about CETA? Alberta Federation of Labour President Gil McGowan says it's time to make some noise.
And so what I think we need to do is take what we've learned tonight back to our homes, back to our workplaces, back to our communities. We need to talk to our friends, our families, and our co-workers, and we need to make some noise. We need to kick in the door, turn on the light, and make things really messy, because what we've learned is that there's nothing more powerful than the power of public outrage.
Let's make some noise. Join our postcard campaign. Sign the petition against CETA. Work with others to make your city and school board pass a resolution against CETA. Demand action and accountability from provincial governments. Take this on in your community. Write a letter to the editor. Organize public events or rallies, and lobby the politicians. Together, we can stop this trade deal and protect our communities, healthcare, and public services.
Is the National Chairperson of the Council of Canadians and Senior Advisor on Water to the United Nations. She also chairs the board of Washington-based Food and Water Watch and is a counselor with the Hamburg-based World Future Council. Her leadership and activism have been acknowledged by many honors, most notably by the Swedish Parliament, who awarded her the Right Livelihood Award, known as the Alternative Nobel. She is also the best-selling author or co-author of 16 books, including the international bestseller Blue Covenant, The Global Water Crisis, and The Coming Battle for the Right to Water. David Jacks is Resource Coordinator for the Canadian Federation of Students in Manitoba, a proud member of CUPE Local 3909, and of the Winnipeg chapter of the Council of Canadians. He has been an outspoken advocate in support of public education and public water, leading campaigns to end the sale of bottled water on campuses, beginning with a successful campaign at the University of Winnipeg. The Canadian Federation of Students, with more than 500,000 members, organized in some 80 students' unions from coast to coast, has a long history of activism, opposing trade deals that jeopardize social justice, equality, and civil rights. CFS supports alternative trade arrangements through such projects as its fair trade ethical purchasing services for campuses and community groups. And tonight David's going to talk about the implications of CETA for post-secondary education and democratic rights in Canada. And our final speaker is Paul Moyse, the National President of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, Canada's largest union, with more than 605,000 members. Paul spent 10 years as president of CUPE 500, representing 5,500 municipal workers in Winnipeg, and is a longtime executive member of the Manitoba Federation of Labour. He is vice president of the Canadian Labour Congress and vice president for Public Services International, the global body for public sector unions. Paul is a longtime community volunteer, serving as treasurer of the United Way of Winnipeg, director of the Misericordia Health Center, and Director of the Winnipeg Library Foundation. And Paul Moist has certainly been a real supporter of a lot of the work that we're doing in the community in Winnipeg, and we are really thankful for the support he gives us. Following the presentations from all of our speakers, so we'll allow everyone to present before opening the floor up to questions. And I'm going to start with Paul Moist.
We should begin by talking about what CETA, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, is not about. It's not about ideological opposition to trade. Neither CUPE, nor the Council of Canadians, nor the CFS, nor any thinking group is opposed to managed trade. We're a trading nation. CETA is not being driven either by trade barriers. You remember the debate of 25 years ago and launched by Mr. Mulroney? Most of Canada's current trade with the European Union is tariff-free, or the tariffs that remain have been dropping. That's not what's driving this. We have a significant trading relationship with the European Union, about $98 billion worth of trade in 2009. It's about 1/10 of the size of the trade with our largest trading partner, the United States. It was suggested in 2008, and the federal government used this in the House of Commons a week ago, that this proposed agreement would expand that $98 billion worth of trade by $12 billion. They've since revised that in half. And so it's not insignificant to increase trade by $6 billion, but to add some scale to that, that's worth about 1/3% of GDP for Canada. So it's to be pursued if it's in our interests, but it's not high stakes, 1/3% of GDP. And that gain has to be measured against what is Canada giving up, if anything, in the European trade agreement. For the Europeans, it's 1/10 of that 1/3%. So they are pursuing a trade agreement with Canada which will not move the GDP of Europe. So there's no big gains for the Canadian economy. We've polled Canadians about this as little as a month ago, and not surprisingly, 71% of Canadians surveyed said they support a free trade agreement with the European Union. When you dig a little deeper, 60% of Canadians, when you ask them, oppose the opening up of all government purchasing to competition with European countries. Canadians oppose CETA if it would increase the cost of prescription drugs. And as the short video said, and I'll get into this in a moment, there's no question it's going to add in the near term to the price of already too high pharmaceutical drugs. 67% of Canadians, the number rises if you prove that the pharmaceutical drugs are going to go up. And here for this community, you'll understand this, many also oppose the opening up of water and wastewater treatment services to companies in Europe. Only 40% support opening these services to European competition, 52% oppose it. We also did an Environics poll last year asking about the trust of Canadians in key public services like water. 81% of Canadians from across the country, a 3,000-person sample, trust the public sector more than the private sector to provide drinking water treatment services, to operate those services. A strong majority, 89% of Canadians, think that the public sector protects the public interest the best. 88% say the public sector ensures accessibility, universality, if you will, of access to services. 79% say the public sector is best able to protect safety standards, and 71% believe being open and transparent happens more in the public sector than in private hands. So what is CETA about if it's not about the things I just mentioned? Well, number one, it's being driven by the European Union, failed discussions with the former Chrétien government, and the Europeans are demanding as a beginning point for these negotiations, which began 18 months ago, services coming under the federal, provincial, local government levels, crown corporations, public transit, water, airports, health and social services. Most of these services I mentioned were exempted from the free trade agreement discussions or the North American Free Trade Agreement discussions. The Europeans are demanding investor rights, so that Chapter 11 if you will, corporate rights to claim for compensation if corporations are denied access to procurement for these kinds of public services above a certain threshold. All of these discussions are in camera. Round 8 begins in Brussels in 2 weeks. The Council of Canadians, CUPE, and other civil society groups will have people present. The thresholds being talked about are $300,000 in the area of goods and services, and $8 million in terms of hard infrastructure. And there's not a bridge in this city that isn't worth triple or 4 times the $8 million. You know, the treatment plant, water treatment plant discussion from a year ago was into the hundreds of millions of dollars. So when Canada's mayors and councillors talk about a $125 billion municipal infrastructure deficit, most of those pieces of infrastructure, roads, treatment plants, other civic services, are far in excess of $8 million. All of those, under what the Europeans are asking for, would have to be open for global bidding. What's the consequences of a Chapter 11 kind of investor-state rights being enshrined even deeper than they are under NAFTA or the Free Trade Agreement? Well, we know our experiences with NAFTA and the Free Trade Agreement saw the Canadian government have to pay $16 million to a private corporation, the Ethel Corporation, in damages because Canada banned a gasoline additive which was a known carcinogen. So the Canadian government made policy to ban an additive and had to pay compensation pursuant to the Free Trade Agreement with the United States to the Ethel Corporation. The same thing happened with SD Myers. Canada chose to ban a toxic PCB waste and paid $20 million in compensation to this private company. Maud will speak of Abitibi-Bowater, where the stakes are getting higher. The City of Toronto, a number of years ago, under the David Miller administration, made a policy decision endorsed by 3/4 of their council, 80% of Torontonians, to purchase new streetcars for their public transit system from Bombardier in Thunder Bay, a sole-sourced contract. Why did they do that? They wanted to support Ontario, Canadian jobs in Thunder Bay. They thought it was a world-class product. They chose not to go to a North American or a global tender. That would not be allowed if the Europeans get what they want out of CETA. So government, in our name, should bear consequences from the public if they make bad decisions that the public doesn't agree with. We should not be trading away the autonomy of any level of government in Canada. Another area that the video talked about, I'll spend a moment on, is intellectual property protection. What the heck is that? Well, you know that Mr. Mulroney provided one of the better collective agreements, if you will, to pharmaceutical companies, patent protection, which blocks generic drug makers from introducing more affordable drugs that we access in one of 2 ways: through our government programs, our healthcare systems, or at the level of the workplace, negotiated benefit programs at work. The European Union is home to some of the largest, a couple of the largest pharmaceutical multinationals on the planet. This is 15% of Canada's current trade with the European Union is in drugs, prescription drugs. What do the Europeans want? They absolutely insist on an extension of 5-year patent protection. So what does that mean for Canadians? Well, the generic drug makers hired a professor from the University of Calgary and a colleague of his from the University of Toronto, and they predict in 2009 dollars, this would add $2.8 billion to the current cost of pharmaceuticals in Canada, because it would block for 5 more years the introduction of generic drugs. 1.3 billion of that drug increase cost would be in the public realm, and 1.5 would be in private drug plans that many of us have at work. Manitoba's share, as reported in the Globe and Mail, our pharmaceutical price tag would go up $80 million in 2009 figures to provide the Europeans with the increased protection for multinational pharmaceuticals that they want. And I can say on behalf of CUPE and I think many citizens, I reject any move for increased patent protection. Canadians want cheaper drugs, not more expensive drugs. We absolutely reject this, and the Government of Canada should reject any move by the Europeans to jack up the cost of pharmaceuticals here in Canada. CETA also is about access to health care and its future expansion. Imagine, not in the current realm in Ottawa, but imagine a different government wanting to expand nationally in cooperation with provinces and territorial governments, home care, or a national public, not-for-profit, long-term care system, or child care system. New programs would not be able to be introduced without the threat of compensation from one of the largest growing private aspects of healthcare on the planet, long-term care. There's money to be made in long-term care. They will want access to the Canadian market, and they view Canada as a market. The European Union is viewing these trade talks as access to portions of the Canadian market, if you will, to use their word, that have never been opened up under trading arrangements, even under the free trade agreement or under NAFTA. I don't know that Canadians will ever accept a predetermined private aspect to something like national child care or its Medicare system. But that's the consequences of what's on the table right now. It's why the Europeans are insisting, unlike NAFTA or the free trade agreement, that CETA must apply to subnational governments. They've insisted, the Europeans, unlike earlier in the millennium, that provinces must be at the table. So we've done our best. We really only have access to 2 provincial governments in Canada to speak with, to share our research. Others give us lip service, but it's hard to even get a meeting. But we've met with extensively the governments of Manitoba and Nova Scotia, because we need voices at that table that protect our interest in expanding in the future healthcare. National child care system is a policy option many Canadian families need, and it should never be taken off the table, and we should never predetermine there'll be a private component to any of these public needs, I'll call them. So CETA has the potential to diminish the role of governments, of crown corporations, to manage the public sector in the public interest. Canadians, on the eve of the budget, the first budget that caused our recent federal election, the day before, March the 2nd, there was a 5,000-person sample survey across Canada with no suggested answer. What are the top issues that, in your view as a Canadian, for tomorrow's budget? What are the top issues? The top 2 issues by far, they were in the 20s. The next issue was under 5%. So 5,000 Canadians answered the question this way. The number 1 issue for them was Medicare and jobs in the economy. These were the issues driving Canadians' concerns at that moment in time, March of this year. The EU wants access to Canadian resources and to the public sector. This is not about investment in Canada to increase the manufacturing sector. When we began the debate in 1988 on the free trade agreement, 20% of the Canadian workforce was in manufacturing or manufacturing-related industries. Today, that's 10% and falling. Good-paying manufacturing jobs, the control of the Canadian economy, if you believe ownership of firms has anything to do with good-paying jobs or decisions in the interests of communities, Canada's not fared well in 25-plus years of free trade agreements. These agreements are never negotiated out in the open. Why can't Canada be like Australia? A 1 or 2 seat majority for the Labour government in Australia. They have determined, in a motion through Parliament, they will enter into no trade deals that have as a quid pro quo or a demand a Chapter 11 kind of investor state rights. They won't sign an agreement that gives corporations the right to sue governments over public policy decisions. So to close, trade deals must relate to what's fair and good in terms of management of Canadian resources, what's fair and good about preserving the rights for democratically elected governments at the municipal, school board, or provincial level to exercise their autonomy, what's wrong with the Manitoba government expanding hydro capacity in northern Manitoba and signing deals with First Nations for employment or ownership, part ownership, as was reported in Saturday's Free Press, of the new generating capacity. All of these things are not put out to tender. They're sole sourced, or the Quebec Hydro. All of the rights of way to string lines from northern Quebec to southern Quebec and to the northern United States, all of that work, clearing bush, is run by Aboriginal companies now in negotiated agreements between the government of Quebec and First Nations in Quebec. Not put out to tender, well in excess of the $8 million threshold that we're talking of. And if the people of Quebec and their government want to do that as a partial compensation for interrupting lands that people have lived on for hundreds of years, that can't and shouldn't be negotiated away by any level of government. No talk of CETA in the recent federal election, save and except for Mr. Harper's promise to finish the negotiations by the end of the year and implement this deal before mid-2012. We have a Prime Minister with a majority government now who didn't and won't discuss Medicare, won't meet with Canada's premiers to talk about the signature social program for all Canadians. And he's holding the negotiating keys, if you will, with the European Union. I think it's sinful that there hasn't been more public discourse about this, which is why Maud made this brilliant suggestion earlier in the year that we go across Canada, that we speak with student newspapers, with community groups. Today we met with some members of Winnipeg City Council, with members of the Legislative Assembly, and we try to create a conversation in Canada about the kind of Canada we want. If we don't do that, CETA flies under the radar, and Canadians will wake up one day with irreversible decisions on procurement. So the video talked about what you can do as you're doing tonight, informing yourself, writing your MP, speaking to your councillor, writing your MLA, and spreading the word. And if we create the kind of pressure that I know we're capable of, we can put front and center the autonomous right of our elected governments to make policy decisions that are not reviewable by private interests and certainly aren't contestable by private interests. So I say to Maud and the Canadian Federation of Students, thank you for caring about the community. We in CUPE want to work with all segments of the community to protect the public services that our parents fought for and to build new and improved public services, and that can't happen if we trade away our sovereign right to determine our own fate. CETA deserves much more attention than it's getting, and what the Europeans are demanding for is too high of a price. We ought to expect that all elected officials at that table, provincial and federal, don't cave in to corporate interests and stand up for the rights of all Canadians.
My remarks tonight will center around the potential impacts of CETA on one of the most important and rapidly growing sectors in our economy and society, that's post-secondary education. So I hope I'll be able to add to the discourse around CETA by drawing in post-secondary education. I'll quickly note that I do recognize that the correct grammatical way of expressing the acronym is the CETA, but as I'm sure you'll notice, it's far easier just to say CETA, so the remainder of the presentation I'll just drop the other the. So it's no surprise that students, faculty, and researchers across the board would raise concerns about CETA. The student movement has been in staunch opposition, as mentioned, of any bilateral or multilateral international trade agreements that could put our public services at risk of privatization. At its core, privatization means reduced services, bare minimum regulatory standards, job loss, and reduced wages, and one single motive, that is profit. Scott Sinclair's briefing, an investment series for the CCPA, which is actually printed out on the back table for you, notes that the goal of CETA is to open new markets, as Paul mentioned, in Canada, to European corporate interests, including many vital public services. Students have long recognized that these trade agreements seek to undermine and destroy our access to quality education, opening the doors to our universities and colleges to more and more privately funded research, and in some cases, private corporations operating entire facilities and departments. And in this case, I'm thinking Navitas, for one, a private college at the University of Manitoba that uses public resources and undermines existing staff and faculty for bare minimum programming to simply exploit international students. Or perhaps Monsanto's national headquarters at the University of Manitoba funding agricultural research. Or perhaps Cisco Systems at the University of Winnipeg, our human rights university, providing expertise in telecommunications. This is the same company that develops the software used to restrict the internet in China. And the list goes on. I'm sure Lloyd Axworthy is very proud of that fact. In October 2000, the Canadian Federation of Students presented to the Department of Foreign Affairs during the General Agreement on Trade and Services deliberations that education is a fundamental right, not a privilege limited to the wealthy. This right does not make a distinction between primary, secondary, or post-secondary education. And in fact, the 1970s United Nations Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights explicitly states that education at all levels is the right. Canada is a signatory to that covenant, and I mean, no one would argue that a covenant carries more weight or less weight than maybe an agreement, but unfortunately, this is not the case. I bring up the General Agreement on Trade and Services, also known as GATS, because the analysis can shed some light on the environment that exists in the post-secondary sector today that CETA can use as a thin edge of the wedge for our education systems. In the context of the GATS, post-secondary education was excluded. However, as outlined by the Canadian Federation of Students' June 3, 2011 position paper on CETA, the exclusion of post-secondary education from the GATS was a weak exclusion based on the condition that public services are defined as services that are either provided neither on a commercial basis nor in competition with any one or more suppliers. So if you take a look at our post-secondary education system today, you'll see that students are paying nearly half the cost of their education in Ontario and Nova Scotia, more than half the cost, as this position paper points out, making it currently definable as a commercial transaction. So the Canadian Association of University Teachers, which has done a lot of work around CETA, noted in 2007 around the GATS that the distinction between public and private education services is exceedingly difficult to draw. Canada's public universities and colleges are increasingly reliant on private revenues, primarily in the form of tuition fees. They do go on to note that DFAIT's Research and Development Services Industry discussion paper on the WTO GATS negotiations, that research and development in particular, as was mentioned, appear as a subsector of business services in the GATS and involve activities related to natural sciences and engineering, social sciences and humanities, and interdisciplinary research services. So the Canadian Association of University Teachers continues in saying that GATS rules are designed to promote free trade in educational services by guaranteeing open markets for all providers, public or private, non-profit or for-profit. Now you may recognize that CETA is a different beast from the GATS, that exemptions and interpretations of the GATS are not necessarily the same as those in CETA. But again, CAUT highlights that the underlying link between the two that offers the clearest insight into the threats that are on the horizon are that post-secondary education has, of course, always been international in scope. We're not going to debate that. Students and teachers have for centuries crossed international borders as part of academic pursuits. What characterizes the current environment, however, is not so much this mobility of students and teachers, though the sheer volume has increased. Rather, it's the increasingly market-oriented delivery of education and the prominent role played by for-profit providers, the aggressive recruitment of full fee-paying international students, the growth in cross-border e-learning, the franchising of offshore campuses, and the sale of curricula and course materials overseas that are all features of an emerging multi-billion-dollar trade in education. You may say, but David, don't many European countries offer free post-secondary education? Aren't European countries a haven for socialist policy wonks? And what's the harm in harmonization to that? My dad is somewhere in the crowd. He was educated in the Netherlands for free. But let's take a look for a moment at the European Union's current post-secondary environment. And it's going to be a little different from probably what my father remembers. And I think this is going to be the most formidable piece that draws the GATS, CETA, and public post-secondary education in Canada together. The EU is going through a kind of post-secondary education makeover, and I'll tell you, the result of this makeover is going to be pretty nasty. Since 1999, the EU has been developing a framework called the Bologna process to establish a European higher education area with the goal of harmonizing all EU and some non-EU post-secondary education sectors with the goal of, quoted from their document, the globalization of European advanced education. One of the goals in this framework is to adopt aspects of the American system of higher education, and the US is of course one of the top 3 most expensive places to study in the world. Criticisms of this framework has resulted in student demonstrations and strike in France, 5,000 students taken to the streets in Zagreb, Croatia in 2008, walkouts across Germany and Italy, and occupations and blockades of universities in Spain just last year, and a Europe-wide week of action, many of which resulted in brutal police repression. Academics in Europe state that it's so obvious that the economic view on higher education recently developed and formulated by the EU Declaration is similar and comparable to the view developed by the WTO and the GATS, that increased tuition and fees, access to private investment is soon to be the norm in Europe. In fact, these reforms to standardize European education has led to governments introducing tuition fees for the first time in order to maintain this pan-Canadian standard of quality and cost. So it's in this context, the context of the European Union's new post-secondary education framework, the one of privatization, increased costs, and in most cases, the actual removal of local government's ability to set tuition, funding, and research policies, and we bring CETA back into the picture in this context. The Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreements is like GATS, but now with a different European climate, far less friendly to fully public post-secondary education. What we can expect, should CETA be ushered through, is more freedom for corporations to create and build education as a business, essentially by undermining public funding with corporate dollars, increasing tuition fees out of the reach of most, and as is happening today in England, and let's not kid ourselves, the rapid privatization of education in the UK is a direct result of our Prime Minister Harper's call for austerity measures during the G8 and G20. It also includes the growth of private ownership and the integrity of our university and college research outputs. Case in point, again, Monsanto at the University of Manitoba, and as Paul mentioned, pharmaceutical companies suing students who blow the whistle on companies that refuse to disclose harmful products. Not all is lost, though. I think many of us in this room are only now learning about CETA, are a little bit dazed and confused. CETA on its own is dangerous and it's hard to recognize all the parallels between the existing inter and international trade negotiations and their impacts and relationships with CETA, as I mentioned with the Bologna process in Europe. It's only been a couple years since we were talking about the Security and Prosperity Partnership and the impacts it'll have on our communities, but sitting here again beside Maud Barlow, who led the fight and won against the SVP, gives me strength and hope. Sitting here with Paul Moyes, who's leading the charge to protect our future jobs and pensions against a government that legislates rather than negotiates workers back to their jobs, gives me strength and hope as well. Sitting here with, again, Shauna McKinnon from the CCPA, who's leading for the fight against poverty locally, which is so rampant in Manitoba, and especially amongst Aboriginal communities who are already facing reliance on private water. It also gives me strength and hope. It's this kind of expertise, not unlike the expertise of so many that I see sitting in this room, that makes me confident that we can defeat CETA and protect our communities, livelihoods, and public education. Like the students in Europe, the demonstrators at last year's G20, Aboriginal activists blockading up at Wasquatam, the demonstrators, again, here in Winnipeg, defending our public water. We can't be afraid to take to the streets. We can't be afraid to occupy the boardrooms, blockade the superhighways, and get our messages out to our friends, family, and colleagues, as Paul just mentioned. And let's not kid ourselves. This isn't like a lobbyist's lullaby. We're not going to get very far simply by wearing a suit and tie and sitting in a room with Stephen Harper. It's a battle. So I look forward to hearing everyone's thoughts on how we can fight this together and win. Thank you very much.
I'm just going to add a couple of thoughts to what's been said tonight, and then we want to open this up to discussion with you. I guess one of the reasons that you're probably, a lot of you, hearing about this for the first time is that, although some of us have been fussing about it for almost 2 years now, are two reasons, I would say. One is that the Harper government does not want us talking about this. This is a very different animal than Brian Mulroney. Any of those of you who remember those days with first of all, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA will remember Mulroney boasted about it. Give me 20 years and you'll never recognize this country, he would say. The first thing he ever did when he got into power was go down to New York City and speak to a blue chip audience of about 600 CEOs and say Canada's open for business. And he took out a 9-page color supplement in the New York Times called Canada-Open for Business, and warned us then that change was coming and we were going to like it, and if we didn't, we were going to have it anyway. But it was a feisty fight that we had. A lot has changed. These guys know that if we find out what's in these agreements, we're not going to like them. As Paul said, if you ask people if they like the idea of trade with Europe, of course we say yes. When you start telling them the details of the agreement, they turn off it. So they have kept this deliberately quiet. It has not been on the mainstream newspapers, except now and then in the business section. Even the CBC just reports on this as if it's just the next normal step in our economic development. So it's been a deliberate attempt to keep this out of the realm of debate, and that's the job that we've set ourselves to do as we go across the country, is to talk to people and get people riled up, and as David says, prepared if we have to take to the streets. The other reason is that I think most of us think of Europe, when we think of it at all, as being cool, better environmental standards, good public services, better than the US in many ways. And so we say, well, why would we not want to diversify? Isn't that a good thing? If this CETA were with the United States, there would be a lot more concern, because this is a much deeper level of trade than any that has gone before it. NAFTA did not include subnational procurement, neither did the WTO. But you need to know, and both my co-speakers have said this tonight, Europe is not what it used to be. They are moving towards public-private partnership as a model in almost every sector. And they've done it by agreement. They've done this by the European-wide agreement on procurement, and they actually name the systems whereby they're going to basically one by one move to public-private partnerships in transit, in energy, in water delivery, you name it, they're moving, and that's why they have all these great big huge corporations ready to kind of burst out of Europe and move on to greener pastures, because they have been taking over where the public sector left off. I think it's really important for us to know this. So what I want to add, because Paul's talked so well about the threat to public services and local democracy and local procurement, and David has spoken about post-secondary education, I want to make the point here that CETA is also a massive grab for resources in a permanent way. The EU is in a race with China for the world's raw resources. Both are knowing that you cannot be a superpower if you don't get a hold of the things that you need for the building blocks of a superpower. The EU wants access in perpetuity to our gold, our diamonds, oil, natural gas, uranium, potash, forests, fish, nickel, and coal, so it can manufacture the big ticket items and sell them back to us. And there is a new European-wide policy called the EU Raw Resources Material Initiative that seeks through CETA, and CETA with Canada, these negotiations with Canada is only one of a number that Europe is negotiating with other countries. So with these CETAs and tough enforcement rules, they want permanent access to our resources, very much the way NAFTA gave the US permanent access to our energy, as if our energy really is no longer ours. The agreement that we signed back with NAFTA, well actually even the earlier Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, basically churned Canada's energy into North American energy. Just read the other day that I think it's 80% of funding for the National Energy Board comes from corporations, and then that includes the salaries. It's just a stunning concept if you stop and think what we're dealing with. I mean, we literally handed it over to the corporate sector, including all the monitoring, all the assessment, all the yes and no to who gets access to it. So what does this mean for Canada? Well, there was a European Commission does a study on every new trade agreement and what it will mean both to Europe and to the trading partner. And they actually said there are serious concerns environmentally for Canada. First of all, they said this would be bad for First Nations in the north. It said they would open up these areas for exploitation, massive mining, industrial, forest, energy development, leading, and I quote, to soil and air and water contamination. This is their words, not ours. Of course, our government didn't do any such study, and if it did, it's not telling us. But as we know, the Harper government is already threatening to pull out of CETA if Europe goes ahead with plans to block tar sands oil because it's dirtier than conventional oil. And so to our shame, the Harper government is using this potential trade agreement to try to shape and reform European environment policy. And this from a man who pulled Canada out of Kyoto, the only government in the world to have both ratified it and then abandoned it. I think it's no stretch to say that Stephen Harper and the Harper government are eco-outlaws. Now, it's the same story in food, with the Harper government using CETA as a bribe, offering up Canada's supply management in exchange for Europe dropping its restrictions on our GE grain and hormone-laced beef exports. The National Farmers Union says the goal is to destroy the wheat board and supply-managed poultry and dairy farming in Canada and further erode the right to save, exchange, and sell seeds from their crops. They say that the language is so strict that if you are even suspected of allowing some, even if it blew onto your land, these patented seeds, that they can even seize your land, seize your equipment, and seize your bank account. This is very clearly defined intellectual property rights in CETA. It goes far farther than any other agreement has so far. CETA will also prohibit programs that favor buy local food policies where schools, hospitals, and municipalities support local farmers by supporting local produce and favoring in their procurement policies. Give you a quick example of two hospitals in Ontario. One is the Kingston General, which has outsourced its food production to a huge European company called Compass. Compass has 430,000 employees worldwide and serves 4 billion meals a year, all prepackaged, all vacuum packed. I've seen the packages. It says the date on which it was packaged and then eat before, and it's like 3 weeks later, and this is not to be refrigerated. That's how thick this plastic is, thick of the garbage we're talking about here. So Kingston outsourced it, and they outsourced it to Compass's plant in Mississauga. So now instead of using local produce, feeding their patients clean, good, safe, healthy food and employing local people in the kitchen, they're just employing a few people to rip the top off and heat up this food. And meanwhile, Compass is expanding its operations in Canada. Now compare that to the Scarborough General Hospital, which is the first of a number of experiments in a number of hospitals across the country where they want to try to prove that you can produce good local food procured by the local farm community for as little or less than you can when you pay these big companies. And what Scarborough has done is they've actually got a procurement policy that they are going to, whenever possible, source locally. They would not be allowed to do this under CETA. And they would be forced to allow these big European food companies to come in, and Compass is only one of them, and to compete. And in the Kingston General Hospital case, if a future administration changes its mind, decides it doesn't want to feed its people that awful food, you could never do it once CETA is here, because the company that had the contract would have the right to sue you for a broken contract. Loss of local jobs, loss to local farmers, loss of nutritional food to patients. Doesn't matter. What matters is the bottom line and nothing else. And I just want to say that the National Farmers Union reminds us that in the years following NAFTA, 80,000 farm families and farms disappeared in Canada. This is also an agreement that's going to be a huge threat to our public water services. The EU is insisting that drinking water be excluded, and the two biggest European companies, as you saw in the film, are Suez and Veolia, both from France, both absolutely thrilled this deal is taking place. because they know that our aging infrastructure is going to be up for grabs, and they're going to be able to come in and only on the basis of cost. If they come in at the cheaper level and they're big and they can do that, they will always have to be chosen. And remember now that Stephen Harper and many provinces, not this one but many, are actually giving preferential funding to projects, any infrastructure project that turns first to a public-private partnership. So we have a double 1-2 punch. You have a local facility that needs upgrading, you put it out to tender, the federal government says you're only going to get federal money if you put it to a public-private partnership. You've got CETA signed, you've got Suez and Veolia moving in, your hands are absolutely tied. Now, of course, this is going to make this investor state that Paul talked about, this ability of corporations to sue, will make it worse. As Paul talked about, there are a number of examples, but the one that's most appropriate or important to water is one that involved Newfoundland and a company called Abitibi-Bowater, which is a big American pulp and paper company, operated for years in Newfoundland under the signed agreement that they had access to water and timber rights in exchange for creating jobs. 3 years ago, they on their own left. They were not kicked out of Newfoundland, turned around and said to the then Premier of the province, Danny Williams, well, we want to be paid for our water and timber rights that we left behind. And Danny Williams, as he is wont to do, basically told them where they could put that one thought. And so they launched a Chapter 11 challenge against the Harper government, because it's the federal government that signs NAFTA, so you have to go after it at the federal level. Not only did the Harper government not take Newfoundland's side and fight for Newfoundland's right to its water and timber heritage, they didn't even let it go to a NAFTA panel. They just turned around and gave $130 million to the company to show that they're the good Boy Scouts of the world, basically setting the precedent that any company, any American company operating in Canada, agribusiness, pulp and paper, mining, energy, you name it, that needs water in the production of its product, now owns and can claim ownership to that water. And when you think about the tar sands of northern Alberta, over 50% of the energy companies there are American and have those NAFTA rights. While now we're about to extend those rights to companies like Suez and Veolia and Pfizer and you name it, there's just quite a few of them who are standing in the wings, knowing that once the decision to go private has taken place, you can never be able to basically turn it back. CETA is the wrong model, finally, and we want to open this up to talk with you now, but I want to just say lastly that CETA is the wrong model for the world. Everything we know about our fragile planet is, and the state of inequity, the economic globalization, the assault on everything public, the privatization of everything, the deregulation of everything, what we know about it is that it has hurt both humans and the planet, and that we need to redesign our economic and development policies to serve people and the planet. This is absolutely crucial if we and other species are to survive. I mean, just some of the statistics on what we're dealing with: 80 to 90% of the big fish in the sea are gone, 50% of the old growth forest, but that's accelerating at an alarming rate. A new study tells us by 2030, the demand for water will outstrip supply by 40%, which is an absolutely astounding statistic and the toughest we have yet to hear. Minerals we're running out of, you know the story on energy. Well, yet we keep this globalization thing going by cheap water, cheap energy, and this notion that this can never stop, and this model of unlimited growth is okay. And that's what CETA is based on. More stuff, carving out more wilderness, using more ships, creating more highways, more stuff from places, more stuff we don't need from places that are being destroyed to provide it for us. It's the wrong model. We need to have a model, an economic model where the economy and trade serve people. Nobody I know, as Paul said, is against trade or even trade agreements, but these trade agreements are not about trade. They're about transforming the role of government and governance and handing ever more power over to a group of faceless corporations served by the likes of Stephen Harper and, unfortunately, many, many leaders around the world. I want us to remember that we have fought this fight before. I know faces in this room, I fought with you. We did lose the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. We changed the hearts and minds of the majority, but unfortunately the way the vote split, we weren't able to follow through. We did win the hearts and minds on NAFTA, and Jean Chrétien promised 6 total fundamental changes or he would never sign it. And the first thing he did when he took power was sign NAFTA without those changes. And I remember he wouldn't look into the camera. He looked at his shoes when he made that announcement. And I thought, you lied to us. You know you're lying to us. This is the very first thing you've said to us as Prime Minister. And it's a lie. But since then, we've had one success after another. We discovered, literally, and got the information, the text in a brown paper bag, the multilateral agreement on investment, led a fight around the world that stopped it. In fact, the government of France at the time said, this is so outrageous, and the movement has done such great research and such great legal opinions, and their argument is so strong that we believe them and not our own trade advisors, and we're out. And one after another, the countries pulled out till we won. We stopped the extension of NAFTA to the Americas. It was called the Free Trade Area of the Americas, and it's gone. The World Trade Organization, as the Doha round is essentially dead, and it has been, they've been administering last rites. It's shallowly breathing, so they're all going to pretend that it's okay. It's on a form of life support, but really the thing is gone. And we fought and won the Security and Prosperity Partnership for North America, which was a very dangerous next level after NAFTA, where there was a desire to make an agreement to stop the so-called thickening of the border, and the promise was at the American side, well, we'll try to do that if you will adopt all of George Bush's Homeland Security measures and war on terror, which, you know, a good part of which we did. We still stopped it. We even got Obama, before he was president, to say this is an agreement that is only serving the corporate sector, and I won't have anything to do with it if I'm made president. So I want to say this to you because I've gone through this before where people say, what's an MAI? What's an SPP? We're saying now, what's a CETA? A CETA is just a new formation. It's just a new set of letters to say the same old thing, only now they're going for a whole level deeper and further. And it is more important than it ever has been that we come together and that we stand up and say no to this. If it was just us against the Conservatives with their majority in Ottawa, I would say to you we couldn't win because they could just call it at any time. It's not like that. They need the provinces. The provinces need the municipalities in the sense that, although they'll speak for the municipalities, if we can get a lot of upset in the municipalities, being directed toward the provinces, and the provinces coming to the table and saying, well, okay, but not this, and not this, and another province says, I'm not putting this on the table. If we can do that, and we can work as we are with our European counterparts, we can stop this, and this could be the very first victory for the people against Harper. And may I remind you that 3/4 of us did not vote. If you look at those who voted and who they voted for, and include those who didn't vote at all, 3 out of 4 of us did not vote for Stephen Harper and his draconian right-wing positions, and we don't want this agreement. When Canadians find out what's in it, we're going to do with this agreement what we did with the others and say, no, we can do better. The Canadian people have a different set of values than this agreement represents, and you will not, even with your majority, force it upon us. Thank you so much.
There's 2 points that I want to bring up. The Conservative Party of Manitoba, the McFadden government, has as one of its policies to privatize Manitoba Hydro. And I'm quite concerned about that because along with the privatization of Manitoba Hydro, there's also the possibility of them forcing the power lines down the east side of Lake Winnipeg, which is through the boreal forest. And that's one concern that I have. The other concern is probably more wide-ranging, and that is all of these international accords tend to be the nose of the camel or the thin edge of the wedge. And this is just the very start of a creeping takeover of public, local, and government services. And this is something that concerns me. Right now, my mother is getting home care, which is provided by the province. It's excellent, but I am afraid that if this went to private corporations, they'd be in it for the money, and the object would be to get as much work out of each of these women as they possibly could for the least amount of money. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Marvin. It wasn't 15 years ago that the government of Manitoba, then Conservative, embarked on a plan to privatize home care, and it was families and workers that stood up and they backed down from that. So I think the point that was made by Maud and by David, that people need to stand up for what they believe is important in society and push back. Very few governments of any political stripe in Canada run on the privatization ticket. Many walked on that road after they're elected. Today we shared results of a public opinion poll on Manitoba Hydro. Manitobans value their public utility. Mr. McFadden, the would-be premier, leader of the Conservative Party, is not, in fact, he's categorically denying he'll privatize Manitoba Hydro, and I guess on behalf of the 1,300 workers we represent at Manitoba Hydro, we've been to that movie before. Mr. Philman ran in the '95 election stating categorically Manitoba telephone system was not for sale. And it wasn't 6 months after his second majority government that our public phone system was stolen from the people of Manitoba. So we have decided to confront Mr. McFadden on what he has said. He said there's no business case right now to sell Manitoba Hydro, and he won't do it. Well, that's a frightening comment, because if you are a public official who believes that all taxes are bad, and private debt's okay, but public debt is bad, then you're going to start walking down the road of selling assets that Manitobans own throughout the generations in order to pay down debt. There's only been one-term government in the history of New Brunswick, and it was kicked out of office last September. The government of Mr. Sean Graham. They've never had a one-term government, always 2 or 3 terms. Why was he kicked out of office? Because he came up with a harebrained scheme to cut corporate taxes, to entice investment, and sell New Brunswick Power in order to gain a few $billion and pay down the provincial debt. And I don't know about you, but it strikes me that it's Republicans and Conservatives in office who drive the economy into the ground, drive up debt levels, and leave progressives like Obama, and it took Gary Dewar 5 years to shovel out the debt load left by the Philman government. So I don't trust McFadden, and we're going to keep confronting him throughout the election.
Surely there must be a case that the Harper government can make why they want to go for the CETA. What is their best argument that would be saleable to the Canadian public?
In your presentation, you commented, the term they. Could you tell us specifically who are the counterparts from EU that the government is negotiating with? And further, why is Canada at this time interested in moving forward with CETA, with the EU, when in fact EU is in such a mess right now, and they have countries that want to really step out of the Union, and they have the debt, the crises, the financial, woes that perhaps we don't have. We're way ahead of everybody. But why would we want to put our people in this situation? And when we're talking about 3 global structures. We're talking about NAFTA, which is one system that's in place. The other one is the Asia Pacific unit, and now we're talking about EU. And I don't know if you're aware of the fact that all 3 joined together by the year 2015 will be members of what's called the Transatlantic Common Market. Are you aware of that? this part of a whole big plan?
Your question actually dovetails with Peter's question, and what is their best argument, and then what is their real reason? Maybe I can combine them, and I expect Paul has some thoughts on this as well. The best argument is really just the ideology. They just believe that free trade is good and more free trade is better, and they are out there negotiating free trade agreements. Our government, the Harper government, with India, they've just finished with a number of Latin American countries. We were very much opposed to the agreement with Colombia, for instance, because of Colombia's human rights record. They just have this absolute visceral belief in free trade, and the reason is that they are both neoliberal and neoconservative, but most importantly in this case neoliberal. They are handing over to the market all sorts of roles and responsibilities that governments, in our opinion, should provide, because they don't believe government should provide them. And rather than confronting us and saying, we're going to undo this, or we're going to remove the funding, or we're going to shift over to a public sector, they blame it on free trade. You mark my words, if this goes through in 5 years, you'll hear, well, we have no choice because CETA has made us do it. And in many cases, it's a chill effect. There's a whole bunch of experts at the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, and all the provinces and all the departments at the federal level regularly check in with them and say, we want to do such and such, we want to bring in such and such a law, or look at such and such an area. Is it compatible with our trade commitments? And very often they're told, no, you're really pushing it there, and I think you better back off. And we now and then hear about them. Mostly we don't hear about them, but we'll hear from people who know how deeply and wide-ranging the effect of this chill effect is. So I would say that it's an ideological thing. Unfortunately, the Liberals, after having bravely fought the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement for many years, bought into it with both feet as deeply as the Conservatives. So we really have an ideology at play here. I think and their best argument is just simply that it's just, it's more jobs, more everything. Why are they really doing it? Simply because this is their way of extending the agenda that Harper has now, which is, I believe, in the end, also to dismantle our healthcare system, and they're going to do that potentially by not negotiating the new accord in 2014, but rather negotiating individually with the provinces. And by then we may have even more right-wing provinces ready to take over and privatize healthcare. Who are the counterparts? The counterparts are the European Union itself and a bunch of corporations. And you can get this, we can provide this to you, but it's 3 pages long, the number of corporations that have signed this, and it's all the big transnationals. I mean, this is really an agreement brought to you by the same folks that brought us every other trade agreement. It started with the corporate sector, it moved to the elected leaders, and it's still in control of their hands. Just lastly, I want to say that I was invited last week or 2 weeks ago in to meet with the European ambassadors. So the European ambassador to Canada, who's his name is Brinkman from Germany, and then all of the ambassadors from all the different EU countries. There were 25 of them. It was a very weird experience. They looked at me as if I had 3 eyes and horns. But the thing that Brinkman started off by saying, which I thought was just astounding and wanted to share with you, is he said, look, we share all the concerns you have about the environment, about justice, about public services and so on. But Maud, he said, economic globalization is a fact of life. The market rules, market forces dictate everything, and all we're trying to do is adapt in a way that will provide jobs for our workers and for our companies. And I said, you represent the most powerful countries in the world outside of, the US, China, Japan, and so on, but, some of the biggest countries in the world, and you tell me that you're helpless to deal or in any way affect the global economy, that you can't touch regulatory reform on finance, there was nothing you could do about the meltdown 3 years ago. Is that what you're saying? And you imagine how helpless the rest of us feel? If you guys feel that there's nothing you can do, that's why I take it back to ideology, because I don't believe for a moment there's nothing they can do. But I think when you say that and when you have that mantra, then all is well and you can sleep well at night. The other thing they said was, everybody in Europe thinks this is great. We haven't found anybody in Europe who knows anything about it. And we're contacting all our groups. And they said, get this, everything in Europe's fine. Everything's fine. They're going to too many cocktail parties in Ottawa, let me tell you. I think we should put them in little planes and send them home to visit their capital so that they can see what's really happening there. Everything is not fine in Europe. People are fighting against this very agenda extremely hard. 2 weeks ago in Italy, because the Berlusconi government had brought in legislation a year before that said that every single municipality had to privatize their water services or move to public-private partnership within about 5 years. They held a referendum. Of the people who voted, which was huge in terms of Italy numbers, it was 57% voted, 97% of them voted against the privatization, and so they have won. So this notion, and there are 40 municipalities in France, including Paris, that have moved to remunicipalize their water system. So this notion that there's no argument in Europe, and there's just all one happy, free trading family, and even the unions love it, this is what we were told. It's just all sugarcoating, and we just don't listen to that sugarcoating anymore. We know more, we're smarter than that, we can talk to each other, we have our social media, and we simply will not buy that anymore.
Just underscore, Maud was reading from the Canada-Europe Roundtable for Business to answer this gentleman's question. They were at the announcement, May 6, 2009, when the European Union Parliament and the Government of Canada started walking us down this road. Pretty much in camera since then. Who was there for Canada in Prague, May the 6th, 2009? Alcan, Barrick Gold, AG Forest Products of Canada, GlaxoSmith, SNC-Lavalin, Suncor, Techminco, TSX Group, etc. 101 corporate CEOs from Canada and the United States, or the European Union. So that's the driving force behind this, along with the new NDP trade critic is a former regional director for CUPE in Atlantic Canada, Robert Chisholm. So he had the audacity 2 weeks ago to stand up and ask that gentleman's question in Parliament. And he asked the question, could you ensure that these discussions are out in the open and in the interest of Canadians, and Canadians have a say? Here's the answer he got. Mr. Speaker, a trade agreement with the European Union would increase trade dramatically. This would create new jobs, prosperity, and ensures our long-term prosperity as a country. Next, he's going to say there's an Easter bunny, because this is the mantra for 25 years. And remember what Bob White and Maud and others said 25 years ago. Trade deals don't happen in a vacuum. Deregulation, privatization, and free trade is the corporate bill of rights for corporations that know no nationality. It was only 40 years ago in this country there was an election, 1972. Mr. Trudeau lost his huge majority after Trudeau-mania of 1968. What was one of the issues in the election? Well, Mr. Lewis, on behalf of the NDP, Stephen Lewis's father, called them corporate welfare bums. A man named Walter Gordon left the Liberal Party of Canada over the control of the Canadian economy by branch plans. Two things happened in that election: a minority government and an NDP opposition that wouldn't take any seats in cabinet. They wanted things done. One was the creation of the Foreign Investment Review Agency. There was a test if any company wanted to, a foreign company wanted to take over a Canadian business, resource or otherwise. Mr. Mulroney got rid of the Foreign Investment Review Agency, and he created Investment Canada. 16,000 foreign takeovers since 1985, foreign takeovers of Canadian firms. 2 were rejected. The most recent was the Potash Corporation of Canada. In the 1970s, my first professor of economics, Kerry Levitt, called it the silent surrender, slowly allowing branch plants to develop into Canada. It's been a completely open giveaway since then. U.S. Steel in Hamilton, the former Stelco plant, their workers have been on the street since November. What's the issue? They can't afford a defined benefit pension plan, and 9,000 retirees can't have an index pension. And the Government of Canada has reduced to taking them to court for not meeting their job targets. There used to be a time in the history of country where the instruments of government weren't at the beck and call of corporations. They existed to serve communities and people, which is why we need to reject CETA in its present form.
Question regarding CETA, which I haven't read or heard anything about until last week. I got an email. Within CETA, is there anything about ownership of private property? So individual human beings owning private property, is that within the CETA deal at all?
I'm not sure that it is in that form and going after individual private property. More significantly, it's going after investor rights in public realms. So when Watt talks about Abitibi-Bullwater, the treaty in Newfoundland and Labrador was 100 years old, signed in 1905. What did it say? The predecessors of Abitibi-Bullwater can have access to timber and water, because you can't process timber into pulp and paper and things like that without water. You can have that, access to that, in exchange for jobs. It's only a 5-page agreement. Premier Williams, who showed more fortitude than most politicians, said what Abitibi-Bullwater did, what every other multinational forest product company's done. We'll take your trees, Canada, but we'll ship the raw logs. We don't want nothing to do with processing in Canada. Williams said, that's bullshit. We're taking back our water and timber rights. They belong to the people of Newfoundland and Labrador. The company went nuts, filed a complaint under the North American Free Trade Agreement, and on the doorsteps of a hearing, much to the outrage of Danny Williams, Stephen Harper paid out-of-court settlement $130 million to Abitibi-Bullwater, and he said, that's the last bill I'm paying. I'll stick the bill to the next province. So that's worse than individual property rights, because individual property rights are one thing. The people of Canada own the natural resources of Canada, and they can't be given away, and us facing retribution from investor state provisions for gathering back. What Williams did was in the public interest. Bullshit, you're not owning our water or our trees. If you renege on your deal, a deal's a deal, screw off. For Harper to give them 130 cents, let alone $130 million, is not in the public interest. It's a terrible precedent. We need more politicians, I can't believe I'm saying this, to stand up like Williams for what belongs to the people of Canada, which are our natural resources.
I understand what you're saying about the, in effect, it's expropriation without compensation for private use. In Winnipeg, there's a bylaw for expropriation of private property without compensation for private use. And this is now a law as of June 15th, a year ago, that spread across every municipality in Manitoba. So we have expropriation without compensation for private use. Now this, I think, is unique. It was unique in Winnipeg and all of North America, and now it's spread to the whole province. And I think it's the same thing what you're talking about, expropriation of natural resources without compensation for private use. So the Canadian government paying money for something that was taken. Sounds like the same thing, and I was just curious if there's any language within this deal that deals with taking away of any private property, but including, private property being our trees and lakes and air.
I can just mention in terms of post-secondary education, it's not physical private property, but one thing that CETA will undermine is intellectual property. Part of the agenda, as I mentioned or alluded to earlier, was that specifically CETA's, in opening new markets in post-secondary education, is specifically looking at research and development, which is opening doors for private corporations, more private corporations to provide funding to our researchers at our public institutions, and thus obviously directly undermining the public funding. And what that leads to is a question of who actually owns that research. In the past, the research would belong to the researcher, but sort of under this future guise, what's going to be happening is that the research is going to belong to the private corporations. And some of the implications have already been seen in the case of folks like Dr. Nancy Olivieri, who blew the whistle on a pharmaceutical company, and the pharmaceutical company that just turned around and sued her. So, I mean, I'm a little bit frightened to see when those same private companies will then be able to turn around and sue, for example, our provincial or federal governments in terms of their research funding. So intellectual property, I would also kind of like to throw out there as an issue that's likely to be under attack by CETA.
What's the best type of pressure to apply, and where should we be applying it?
I'm overwhelmed again by this information. I had an awareness, but I appreciate the details. I want to highlight that Canada, in the book called Noir Canada by Alain Denet, shows that Canada is the home where 65% of the extractive corporations are registered. So, you know, mining companies are registered in Canada because they get such great return, like benefits, from being in Canada. And it's, you know, just check the websites of Mines Canada and Manitoba, actually, too. Website shows such grants, which are taxpayers' money, you know, being granted to these people. So I wonder if, you know, when you think Barrick Gold and so many are exploiting outside, you know, I'm sure they would have benefits as well, to the CETA. So that's an angle to explore further. About the mining, I'm not sure when this happened. I think I had the illusion that if I own a piece of property and there would be some important mineral in there, that I would be benefiting from it. And there's something about that we have only maybe 5 or 6 inches. I'm just wondering that that's a piece too, that, you know, we don't, as citizens, have access, I think they call it the basement resources. So, but we would have if we asked these corporations to pay enough for what they're extracting. We're kind of giving it away right now, and for jobs. And I hope that we might be connecting with José Beauvais. I don't know if he's still active in France, but he sure is a mobilizer. And just encouraging you to let us know who are partners over there that we can be strategizing.
Thanks, Giselle. Kate, go ahead in the back.
Hi. Maud, I think it was you who mentioned that the media is largely ignoring the issue. And I found that very interesting, and especially, like, it's a complex issue, and you guys gave us a lot of information, but there's a couple of very compelling points, like the drug prices that got a reaction from the crowd, and the procurement, and that Chapter 11 thing. So I would have thought that editorial boards would be interested in talking to you, or reporters might be interested in covering that kind of interesting stuff. So I'm just curious, my question there is what do you do what have you been doing on this cross-country tour to try and meet with editorial boards or send press releases to some of the more brave reporters that are out there? And another question, I think you said that it was the 8th round of talks had just finished, or was going to happen right away, and I wanted to know how many rounds there are.
When we've had to take up causes in the past, we usually go to our usual circle of friends and allies. At least 2 groups that I'm curious about would be the Chamber of Commerce or the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Those type of groups, you would think that they would be curious for their side because of the loss of citizens. So I'm just curious about that.
Just on that latter question, and then the gentleman before him, interestingly, in British Columbia, we're running a campaign called the 10% Shift right now, and our audience is local chambers of commerce, particularly in small communities, business associations, associations of store owners, and our thesis is taken from some incredible microeconomic work going on in some communities in the United States. And the 10% Shift essentially says, if we as citizens or businesses who consume as well spent 10% of our income in the local community on food, on services, just made a conscious effort to spend 10% or more in the local community, we could impact upon the economies of local communities. And we have an incredible audience of overflowing meetings of chambers of commerce listening to CUPE and our research staff explaining the 10% shift and how it's working in Colorado and in Oregon and other communities. People are looking for local solutions in a global world that's kind of frightening to them. So to the last gentleman, Jerry, we do have allies often that we reject outright. And the only way to win a campaign in the face of, I think Maud said, a majority we have the tyranny of the majority right now, is to create a ruckus publicly by expanding the tent. The media, we've done okay. We do better in small town Canada than we do in large urban centers. Many of our media outlets don't have staff on in the evening. We've been shut out by editorial boards, the odd phone call returned, the odd interview given. But getting this on the radar has proved to be a real challenge. Although just the act of having these meetings, this is meeting number 5, there's 2 more before the end of this month, well, this week, and then 6 or 7 more in the fall. We've started to get emails from folks who aren't at the meeting saying, I heard you guys were in town and I heard you had information that I can get my hands on, and it's kind of growing. It's taking a while to gel. And the last thing I'll say is to the lady that spoke, what's the best way to apply pressure? Well, as Manitobans, there are going to be a lot of folks knocking on our doors between now and October the 4th. Do they stand to protect public education in Manitoba, Manitoba Hydro, our healthcare system? We need to do what we did this afternoon. We met with a number of local councillors here in Winnipeg who have a voice in the community, have a voice with the provincial government, who is their voice in these negotiations. And through all of our networks, we have kind of an unlimited capacity to communicate these days. We need to share information as a beginning point, and we need to demand answers, as we're doing in Parliament, from those that are in these negotiations in camera. But job 1 is doing what we're doing tonight and multiplying it. If there's a need for a follow-up meeting in Winnipeg in a number of weeks, it may not be Maud Barlow or myself. We guarantee you we'll have speakers there to expand on the kind of things we're talking on tonight. We need to create a kind of snowball effect that no other group to date in our community is doing.
Just in terms of the media, I mean, I'm a little bit disappointed with our mainstream media that's supposed to be impartial, endorsing political parties publicly. Major newspapers and media outlets are publicly endorsing the same political parties that support CETA in the first place, right? So obviously they're not necessarily going to jump onto the bandwagon right away. But in Winnipeg, one unique new paper that we totally have access to is the paper like the Metro, which is a free paper that's been actually publishing some decent articles on labor action that's been happening in the province, etc. For those of you, so that's for those of you who don't use social media. For those of you who do use social media, for those who don't, try it out, it's kind of fun. For those who do use social media, there's so many new networks to access. Twitter, many folks probably don't use Twitter because they think it's just a bunch of, you're tweeting right now. They think it's just a bunch of status updates like, I just drank a glass of water, awesome. But it's really not. For those of you in this room who don't use Twitter, I can say that every journalist in this country does use Twitter now. Creating some public dialogue, talking about the issues, it's called a hashtag, it's kind of weird. Using a hashtag CETA starts getting journalists to take notice of what people are actually talking about. So using those types of methods, I think, are pretty effective. One just quick example was Tim Hortons was funding an anti-choice event in the United States, providing funds and free coffee for this event. Somebody there, it was in New York, got wind of it, and within 24 hours, people started talking about this. And within 24 hours, CETA issued a public apology, or not CETA, Tim Hortons issued a, that would have been, yes. Tim Hortons issued a public apology on their website, retracting their funding for this event because of a Twitter campaign within 24 hours. So it's another way of getting these issues into the public domain and getting the journalists to actually take note of what people are talking about.
And all I would add, just two things. One is that the journalists this is as new to a lot of the journalists as it is to everybody else. So this is our job now. Unless we can get a groundswell of people talking about this, writing letters to the editor, getting people concerned, even pick one issue like the pharmaceutical, which the more we travel, the more Paul and I are both thinking that this is a really good wedge issue. We've got to get to seniors, we've got to get to people around this issue because it's so clear. When I met with the EU ambassadors, they made it clear this is a deal breaker. So this might be a good place for us to lay the gauntlet down. But I deeply believe in social media. We use it a lot in my organization, but I don't want to give up on mainstream media. It's very important that we hold them accountable. We need to keep doing that. On José Bové, he's a member of the European Parliament. And he's gone proper on us there now, but he's still a good friend. And we are working with him and other members of the European Parliament. So yeah, we've got good allies in Europe. Part of the problem in Europe is that they're fighting this privatization, these public-private partnerships themselves. And see it extended here is not their first fight. Their first fight is in their own community. So it's a little bit kind of like they've gone further, and it's worse there than it is here, so the fight for them is there, not here, but we are making those connections very clearly, and we'll continue to do so.